The evening was filled with light, music, and quiet pride. The Grand Hotel stood tall in the heart of the city, glowing with golden lights that could be seen from far away. Inside, everything looked perfect. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, soft music played in the background, and the air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh flowers. This was not an ordinary gathering. It was a charity gala, hosted by one of the most famous billionaires in the country, a man known for his wealth, power, and influence. People arrived in luxury cars, wearing designer suits and elegant dresses. Laughter echoed across the hall as businessmen shook hands, politicians smiled for cameras, and celebrities posed for photos. Everyone seemed important. Everyone seemed confident. For them, this night was not just about charity. It was about being seen, being respected, and being part of the elite circle that controlled money and opportunities. Waiters moved quietly between guests, carrying glasses of wine and silver trays filled with food that most people could not even name. The staff had been trained to be invisible, to serve without being noticed. Among them were a few young people invited through a special charity program. They were scholarship candidates, students from poor backgrounds who had shown talent and promise. They stood near the edges of the room, unsure where to place their hands, unsure where to look. One of them was a young impoverished girl, barely in her early 20s. Her dress was simple and old-fashioned, clean but clearly worn many times. It did not shine like the others. Her shoes were plain, and her hair was tied back neatly. She did not speak much. Instead, she observed everything carefully. Her eyes moved from the chandeliers to the guests, from the smiling faces to the hidden tension behind them. She had never been to a place like this before. Back home, life was very different. Her world was small, filled with hard work, limited money, and constant struggle. She remembered nights when dinner was just bread and tea, mornings when she walked long distances to attend school, and days when people looked through her as if she did not exist. Yet she had learned something important from those experiences. She had learned patience, self-respect, and silence. Being invited to this event felt unreal to her. The charity organization had selected her because of her academic performance and strong recommendations. They believed she had potential. Still, standing there among billionaires and powerful people made her feel like a guest in someone else's dream. She knew she did not belong to their world, but she believed that learning how their world worked might help her change her own future. The billionaire host arrived with confidence, surrounded by security and important guests. Cameras followed him everywhere. People waited eagerly to greet him, hoping for a smile, a handshake, or a brief conversation. To them, he was success in human form. He spoke about generosity, progress, and giving back to society. His words sounded polished and powerful. The crowd applauded loudly. The girl listened from a distance. She noticed how people admired him, how they laughed at his jokes, how they tried to impress him. She also noticed how rarely anyone looked at the service staff or the scholarship students. It was as if there were two different worlds in the same room, one filled with comfort and attention, the other filled with silence. Despite feeling small, the girl stood straight. She reminded herself why she was there. This night was not about luxury for her. It was about opportunity. It was about education, about escaping the life of constant worry she had known since childhood. She told herself to stay calm and grateful, no matter what happened. As the event continued, guests moved freely, glasses in hand, talking about investments, companies, and future plans. Laughter mixed with music. The girl took a small step forward to better see the stage, unaware that this simple movement would soon change everything. She did not know that one moment, one accident, would place her at the center of attention in a room where she was supposed to remain unseen. The night that began with shining lights and polite smiles was slowly moving toward a moment no one could imagine. The exclusive event, meant to celebrate generosity and success, was about to reveal a truth far deeper than wealth, a truth that would challenge everyone present and remind them that dignity does not depend on money. The girl took a slow step forward, still trying to understand the world around her. The music was soft, the lights were bright, and voices mixed together like a low river of sound. She held her hands together, careful not to touch anything expensive. Every move she made felt important, as if one wrong step could expose how different she was from everyone else in the room. At the same time, the billionaire host was moving confidently through the crowd. He walked fast, laughing loudly, surrounded by people who wanted his attention. A glass of red wine rested in his hand as he spoke about business deals and future plans. To him, the evening felt routine. He had attended hundreds of events like this. Fancy halls, polite applause, smiling faces, it was all familiar. The girl did not notice him approaching. She was focused on the stage ahead, where a speaker was talking about opportunity and change. For a brief second, the noise around her faded, and she felt hopeful. She imagined a future where she could study freely, support her family, and live without fear of hunger. That thought gave her courage. Then it happened. The billionaire turned suddenly to greet someone behind him. His hand moved quickly, and the glass tilted. In a heartbeat, deep red wine spilled out, splashing across the front of the girl's simple dress. The cold liquid soaked into the fabric, leaving a dark stain that could not be hidden. Time seemed to stop. The music continued to play, but the people nearby fell silent. Several heads turned at once. Conversations paused halfway through sentences. The girl froze, her eyes wide, her body stiff. She looked down slowly, seeing the stain spread like a wound across her dress. For a moment, no one spoke. The billionaire looked at her, surprised, then annoyed. His eyes moved from the stained dress to her face, then back again. Instead of apologizing immediately, he frowned, as if the accident itself had disturbed his evening. A few guests gasped softly. Others watched with curiosity, waiting to see what would happen next. The girl felt her heart beat faster. She felt heat rise to her face. Memories rushed into her mind, being laughed at in school for her old clothes, being judged for where she came from, being treated as less because she had less. For a brief second, she wanted to disappear. But she did not cry. She did not step back. She did not lower her head. The billionaire cleared his throat and waved his hand slightly. "These things happen," he said casually, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "Someone will take care of it." He gestured toward the staff, as if the situation was a small inconvenience, nothing more. His words landed heavily in the room. Some guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Others nodded, as if agreeing that money could solve everything. A staff member rushed forward, holding napkins and offering apologies on behalf of the event. The girl felt surrounded, not by support, but by attention that made her feel exposed. The stain on her dress was now impossible to ignore. It marked her clearly as different. Poor. Out of place. She lifted her head and looked directly at the billionaire. Her eyes were calm, but there was something strong in them, something unexpected. The room seemed to hold its breath. Inside her, a quiet decision was forming. All her life, she had been silent when people underestimated her. She had learned to stay quiet to survive. But this moment felt different. This moment felt important. Not just for her, but for something larger. The billionaire waited, clearly expecting her to step aside or accept the situation quietly. He was used to people agreeing with him, thanking him, or staying silent in his presence. But the girl did none of those things. She stood still, her stained dress visible to everyone, her posture straight. The silence stretched longer, growing heavier. People leaned in slightly, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. What started as a simple accident was no longer just an accident. It had become a mirror, reflecting the difference between wealth and worth, power and humanity. And just as the billionaire began to turn away, believing the moment was over, the girl finally opened her mouth to speak, about to say something that no one in that room was prepared to hear. The silence that followed felt heavier than the music and louder than the crowd. Every eye in the room was fixed on the girl standing in the middle, her dress stained red, her presence suddenly impossible to ignore. What had been a night of polite smiles and controlled laughter had turned into an uncomfortable pause, the kind people did not know how to escape from. Whispers slowly began to move through the crowd. Some guests leaned toward each other, speaking in low voices. A few shook their heads with small, judgmental smiles. Others looked away, pretending not to notice, as if ignoring the moment would make it disappear. No one stepped forward to truly help. No one asked how the girl felt. The staff member who had rushed over dabbed at the stain with a white napkin, but it only spread more. The red color grew darker, more visible. The girl quietly stepped back, not because she was ashamed, but because she felt the weight of so many eyes pressing on her. Her hands trembled slightly, though her face remained calm. The billionaire stood nearby, checking his watch and glancing around as if looking for an escape from the awkward moment. To him, this situation was an inconvenience. He had an image to protect. Important people were watching. He did not want this moment to define the evening. "You can take her to the restroom," he said to a staff member, his tone flat and distant. "We'll handle it later." Handle it later. The words cut deeper than the wine ever could. The girl understood what he meant. Clean the mess. Remove the problem. Make it invisible again. She was not a guest in his eyes. She was a stain that needed to be wiped away. As the staff member gently touched her arm, guiding her toward the side of the hall, the girl felt something rise inside her. It was not anger. It was something older, something built over years of being ignored, judged, and underestimated. It was the feeling of knowing her worth, even when others refused to see it. She stopped walking. The staff member paused, confused. The girl slowly turned back toward the crowd. Her movement caught everyone's attention again. The whispers stopped. The room fell quiet once more. She looked around the hall. She saw expensive watches, shining shoes, confident smiles. She also saw fear, fear of discomfort, fear of truth, fear of moments that money could not control. The girl took a deep breath. This was not the first time she had been humiliated. But it was the first time she had the chance to speak where it mattered. People expected her to apologize. Some expected tears. Others expected silence. No one expected strength. She looked directly at the billionaire. He met her gaze, surprised by her calmness. For the first time, he really looked at her face, not as a problem, but as a person. Still, he said nothing. The girl felt her heart pounding, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "but I don't think cleaning the dress will clean the moment." A few people gasped quietly. The billionaire frowned, confused. The room leaned into her words. She continued, her voice gaining quiet confidence. "You spilled wine on my clothes, but that's not what hurts. What hurts is how easy it was to treat me like I didn't matter." The air felt tight. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at the floor. "I know I don't belong to your world," she said, "but I still belong to this room. And respect doesn't cost anything." Her words were simple, but they landed with force. The billionaire opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time that night, he did not know what to say. The girl was no longer just a poor scholarship student standing in the corner. She had become a voice that could not be ignored. The public humiliation that was meant to silence her had done the opposite. It had given her a moment. And in that moment, the balance of power in the room had quietly begun to shift. Everyone could feel it. What started as a careless accident had now turned into a mirror, forcing the crowd, and especially the billionaire, to face something far more uncomfortable than a stained dress. The girl stood tall, her dignity untouched, while the room waited to see what would happen next. Her words did not fade into the air like polite conversation usually did at such events. They stayed. They echoed quietly in the minds of everyone present. For a few seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the room itself was trying to understand what had just happened. The billionaire stood frozen. He had faced critics, competitors, and powerful rivals before, but never like this. Not from a young girl in a simple dress, standing calmly with a wine stain on her chest. He had expected embarrassment, maybe gratitude for being handled politely. Instead, he was facing honesty. A nervous laugh escaped from somewhere in the crowd, quickly dying out when no one joined in. A few guests glanced at each other, unsure whether to clap, protest, or remain silent. This was not part of the evening's plan. There was no script for moments like this. The girl did not rush her words. She understood that silence could be powerful too. She let it stretch, allowing everyone to sit with the discomfort they wanted to avoid. Her hands were no longer shaking. In that moment, she felt strangely calm, as if something inside her had finally settled. I grew up learning how to stay quiet, she continued, her voice still gentle but clear. Not because I had nothing to say, but because no one wanted to listen. The crowd listened now. When you spilled the wine, she said, I didn't feel angry. I felt familiar pain. The kind that comes when people assume money decides whose feelings matter. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, not accusing, just observing. Tonight is about charity. About helping people like me. But charity without respect feels empty. A woman near the front pressed her lips together, visibly affected. An older man shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his jacket. Some guests nodded slightly, as if recognizing a truth they had long ignored. The billionaire finally spoke, his voice controlled but less confident than before. I didn't mean to offend you, he said. It was an accident. I know, the girl replied calmly. The wine was an accident. The way you reacted was not. That sentence hit harder than anything she had said before. A soft murmur spread through the hall. The billionaire's face tightened. He was not used to being corrected in public, especially not by someone society considered beneath him. She continued, all my life, people have told me to be grateful for opportunities, even when they came with humiliation. But gratitude should not require silence. The staff member beside her looked at her with quiet admiration. For the first time, he did not try to move her away. The girl took another breath. I don't need pity. I don't need a new dress. I need people to see that dignity is not something you earn with money. Her words were simple, spoken in plain English, but they carried years of struggle behind them. Years of walking past luxury she could not touch. Years of being invisible. The billionaire looked around the room. He saw the expressions on people's faces. Some were uncomfortable, some thoughtful, some quietly supportive of the girl. The balance had shifted. He was no longer the center of admiration. He was the one being observed. For the first time that night, he felt exposed. He cleared his throat. You're right, he said slowly, surprising even himself. And I owe you an apology. A collective breath was released across the room. I should have spoken to you as a person first, he continued. Not as a problem to be moved aside. The girl nodded, not smiling, not bowing. She was not there for praise. She was there for truth. Thank you, she said simply. The apology did not erase the stain on her dress, but it changed the meaning of the moment. What began as public humiliation had turned into public awareness. People began to clap, slowly at first, then stronger. Not the loud applause reserved for speeches and donations, but something deeper. Something real. The girl stepped back, returning to the edge of the room, but she was no longer invisible. Conversations around her had changed. People spoke more quietly now, more thoughtfully. And the billionaire, standing under the bright lights of his own event, realized that the most powerful moment of the night had not come from his wealth or influence, but from a young girl who chose to speak when silence was expected. The evening moved forward, but nothing felt the same. A line had been crossed, and a truth had been spoken, one that could not be forgotten. The billionaire's face was a mixture of shock, confusion, and something he hadn't felt in a long time, vulnerability. For years, he had walked through rooms like this one with unshakable confidence. He had been admired, feared, and envied, but never truly challenged in public. And here, standing in a simple dress with a stain across her chest, a young girl had done just that. She had exposed the arrogance and assumptions that wealth had once hidden. He glanced around the room, hoping to find support, an ally, someone who would smooth over the moment. But the faces he met were not cheering for him, they were quiet, contemplative, even uncomfortable. Some were nodding slightly at her words, others exchanging glances that said silently, "Finally, someone is speaking the truth." The staff member who had initially tried to usher her away now stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment unfold. The girl remained composed, her hands at her sides, her gaze steady. There was no fear, no trembling, only clarity. She was not intimidated by the wealth, the power, or the grandeur around her. She knew who she was, and in that knowledge lay her strength. The billionaire cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. He tried to formulate words, to respond with the charm and authority he had mastered over decades, but his usual confidence faltered. Every word he considered felt inadequate. He realized something uncomfortable: money could not buy respect, and influence could not silence truth. The girl had revealed a truth he had long avoided, and now the entire room was witnessing it. Her eyes met his again, calm and unwavering. In them, he saw a reflection of the lives he had overlooked, people who worked hard, who struggled, who deserved dignity and acknowledgement. For the first time, he understood that his wealth and status, while impressive, did not exempt him from accountability. He was not untouchable, and she had just proven it. The billionaire's mind raced. He remembered countless decisions, millions spent, countless people treated as numbers or obstacles rather than human beings. He recalled charitable donations made for recognition rather than genuine impact. He realized that, in that moment, he had been confronted not just by a girl, but by the consequences of a lifetime of decisions. You're right, he said slowly, his voice lacking its usual certainty. He paused, searching for words that felt sincere. I've made mistakes, and I see them now. The crowd murmured quietly, surprised by his admission. They had expected arrogance, perhaps even dismissal, but not acknowledgement. The girl nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. She did not need applause or validation. Her courage had already shifted the atmosphere. Now, the billionaire was the one exposed, the one being seen for who he truly was. He took a small step forward, lowering his eyes briefly. I wanted tonight to be about generosity, he continued, his voice steadier now. But I've realized that generosity without respect is empty. You've reminded me of that. The girl's calm gaze softened slightly, as if recognizing the sincerity behind his words. But she remained careful, aware that change was not declared in sentences, it was proven through actions. Guests in the room began to sense the shift. Conversations that had once been superficial, filled with social posturing, were now infused with thoughtfulness. The power dynamics in the room had changed subtly but profoundly. People who had believed they were untouchable through wealth were reminded that character, integrity, and courage could not be bought. The billionaire swallowed, feeling a rare and unfamiliar weight. He had been admired, envied, and feared for years, yet this moment made him feel small, not because of anyone else, but because he recognized the truth. He had been blind to it for too long. And now, in front of everyone, he could not turn away. The girl took a step back, giving him space, but the impression she left was permanent. She had spoken, not with anger or insult, but with quiet authority. She had reminded the room, and the billionaire, that respect, dignity, and courage were more valuable than any amount of money. In that instant, the billionaire realized he had two choices: retreat behind arrogance, or confront his own flaws and begin to change. The weight of the decision pressed on him, heavy but necessary. He had been humbled, and he could feel the long-term impact of that humility settling deep within him. For the first time, the room was silent in a way that carried understanding. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of reflection. Everyone sensed that something extraordinary had occurred, not because of wealth, status, or power, but because one girl had dared to speak the truth. And in that moment, the billionaire understood something he had never fully grasped: influence is meaningless without integrity, and true strength comes not from wealth, but from the courage to stand and be heard. The room remained still, the air thick with tension and anticipation. The billionaire's eyes lingered on the girl, trying to process the weight of her words. For the first time in his life, he saw past the luxury, the applause, and the curated image of success he had built around himself. What he had overlooked for decades was now undeniable: the human cost of wealth, the unseen struggles of people whose lives his decisions, directly or indirectly, had touched. The girl's voice had not only challenged him but had also exposed a truth that most had chosen to ignore. She had grown up in a world very different from his, a world of scarcity, of hard work for survival, of invisible barriers that wealth could never overcome. Her calm dignity forced the billionaire to confront the reality he often tried to avoid. The numbers, contracts, and profits that he had considered the measure of his power now felt hollow compared to the reality of lives like hers. As he stood there, he remembered a company project that had displaced small communities years ago, a decision that had been praised by the board as profitable and strategic. He had signed the papers, watched the numbers rise, and moved on. But now, looking at her, he realized she might have been indirectly affected by decisions like that: her neighborhood, her family, her friends. The awareness hit him like a punch to the chest. The guests in the room were watching closely, sensing the shift in the billionaire's demeanor. Some whispered to each other, astonished at the change in his expression. He no longer carried the confident, untouchable aura. Instead, there was hesitation, discomfort, and something closer to humility. For years, he had been untouchable because of his wealth. Now he was untouchable only in the sense that no one could argue with the moral truth he was being forced to face. He finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, tinged with vulnerability. I had no idea," he said, almost to himself. "I thought I was helping people with donations, with programs, with initiatives. But I see now that the impact I had might have been harmful." His words stumbled out, unpolished, but sincere. It was a level of honesty he had rarely allowed in public. The girl looked at him steadily, neither forgiving nor condemning. Her purpose was not to humiliate but to make him see, to make the room see, that money without empathy could blind even the most powerful. She realized that acknowledgement was the first step toward real change. The billionaire swallowed hard. "I've lived my life believing wealth and influence were enough," he continued. "I thought generosity could erase responsibility. But you've reminded me, it doesn't. Actions matter more than appearances, and respect matters more than money." A few guests nodded quietly. They had witnessed acts of charity before, but few had seen accountability displayed so publicly. The girl's words had elevated a simple accident into a lesson that everyone could feel, deeply and personally. He looked around, noticing the other scholarship students and staff who had been standing quietly at the edges. They were no longer invisible. He saw the strain in their postures, the intelligence in their eyes, and the quiet dignity that mirrored hers. It was clear that they were not mere guests at his event, they were people whose lives had meaning, whose experiences mattered. He stepped forward slightly, the crowd holding its breath. "I want to do better," he said. "I want to listen more. I want to understand before I act. And I want to ensure that those my decisions affect are treated with dignity, always." His words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. The girl nodded subtly. It was a small gesture, but it carried immense weight. She had achieved what she came to do, not through anger or confrontation, but through clarity and courage. The room had been reminded that the gap between wealth and humanity is bridged not by money, but by empathy and understanding. The billionaire realized that this encounter would stay with him forever. It was no longer about his status, his influence, or his reputation. It was about the truth he could no longer ignore. He had been forced to see the real consequences of his actions, to recognize lives that had been invisible to him, and to understand that power without conscience was meaningless. For the girl, the evening was transformative too, though in a different way. She had stepped into a room where she had been expected to feel small, and she had changed the course of the night with her words. Her dignity had remained intact, her courage had been recognized, and her message had reached the people who needed to hear it most. The event continued, but nothing felt the same. Conversations carried a weight they hadn't before. Laughter was quieter, more thoughtful. Smiles were genuine rather than performative. And the billionaire, once untouchable, now walked through the room with a new understanding of what it meant to truly lead, not with wealth, but with respect, responsibility, and awareness of the lives around him. The night that began as a luxurious celebration of money and status had turned into a lesson in humanity, humility, and the unexpected power of one brave voice. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. What began as a routine gala, a showcase of wealth and influence, was no longer about luxury or appearances. The spilled wine had become more than an accident, it had become a catalyst, and the girl, with her calm dignity, had become the center of attention in a way no one anticipated. Guests who had once smiled politely and laughed at trivialities now whispered quietly, exchanging glances that reflected realization and discomfort. For the first time, the hierarchy of the evening was questioned. The billionaire stood near the edge of the crowd, trying to regain his composure. The familiar armor of wealth, the designer suit, the confident posture, the effortless charm, no longer felt protective. He could feel eyes on him, not with admiration or curiosity, but with scrutiny. The girl had not only exposed the rudeness in his reaction but also revealed a larger truth, the stark divide between his world and hers. The room had begun to see it too. Some guests began to shift their attention toward the girl. They leaned in slightly, as if drawn by her strength. People who had been observing from a distance now whispered quietly among themselves. She was no longer a background figure, an invisible scholarship student. She had taken her place in the narrative, and the attention she commanded was earned, not through wealth, charm, or theatrics, but through truth. The billionaire tried to interject, attempting to explain himself, but each word seemed hollow compared to the clarity in her eyes. She spoke again, softly but firmly, reiterating the importance of dignity, respect, and accountability. Every word resonated with the guests, many of whom had witnessed similar gaps in their own lives, the difference between what appeared on the surface and the reality underneath. He realized something striking. In all his years of success, he had never been held accountable in a way that demanded introspection. Criticism was easy to dismiss, but honesty delivered without anger or malice had a power that could not be ignored. The girl's calm courage had exposed his blind spots and forced him, and everyone around him, to confront them. The billionaire shifted uncomfortably. He noticed the staff and the other scholarship students, who had remained on the sidelines, glancing nervously at the scene. Now, inspired by the girl's words, some began to straighten their posture, their quiet confidence growing. They too felt seen, even if only indirectly. The balance of power in the room had subtly but irrevocably changed. Conversations that had been superficial before now carried weight. Guests who had once been absorbed in networking and showing off their status now listened more intently, thinking about the impact of their own words and actions. A few approached the girl cautiously, perhaps to show support, perhaps to understand what had just happened. For the first time, the voices of the marginalized had been heard, and the room responded, not with condescension, but with attention and curiosity. The billionaire realized that his usual tools of influence, money, connections, charisma, were no longer sufficient. True authority in that room had shifted. It did not belong to the man who had orchestrated the gala or to the guests who flaunted wealth and power. Authority now belonged to the girl who had spoken truth, to the moral clarity she represented. He took a deep breath, finally acknowledging the weight of the moment. "I see now," he said quietly, his voice more genuine than it had been all evening, "that this is bigger than an accident, bigger than appearances. This is about respect, accountability, and understanding the impact of our actions." The room fell silent again, absorbing the gravity of his admission. For the guests, it was a moment of awakening. They had come expecting a glamorous evening filled with applause for wealth and prestige. Instead, they were witnessing a transformation, a reminder that power is not measured by money, and influence is meaningless without empathy. The billionaire's acknowledgement, though delayed, carried significance because it came after being confronted with unfiltered truth. The girl, standing quietly, allowed the moment to settle. She did not seek praise or recognition. Her victory was in the shift itself, the subtle but undeniable change in how the room perceived power, status, and worth. She had shown that courage, dignity, and honesty could recalibrate attention, respect, and influence in a room full of people who had long believed that wealth determined everything. The staff members, once silent and cautious, began to stand taller, inspired by her example. The other students, seeing her strength, felt a sense of possibility that had been absent before. The crowd slowly returned to movement, but the dynamic had changed forever. The billionaire, the guests, and everyone present would remember this night, not for the wine, not for the glitz, but for the quiet courage of one girl who refused to be invisible. By the end of the evening, it was clear that the Real story was not about wealth or extravagance, it was about the lesson learned, the unexpected reversal of power, and the reminder that respect and humanity are stronger than money or status. The girl had spoken, and the world, even in that small ballroom, had listened. The night was winding down, the glittering lights of the ballroom casting long reflections on the polished floors. Conversations that had once been superficial now carried a quiet intensity, each guest reflecting on the unexpected events that had unfolded. The spilled wine, which had seemed like a small accident, had become a symbol, a turning point that none of the attendees would forget. The girl, once a background figure, had changed the atmosphere with nothing but her words and her calm dignity. The billionaire stood apart for a moment, absorbing everything. He no longer felt the usual sense of command that came with wealth and power. The applause, the cameras, and the polite smiles no longer defined him. Instead, he felt something unfamiliar, responsibility. Not the kind that could be managed with money, but the kind that demanded reflection, humility, and action. He realized that the evening's lesson was not just about a spilled glass of wine, it was about seeing people as human beings, not statistics or inconveniences. The girl had returned to the edge of the room, her dress still stained, yet her composure intact. She had no need for validation, her victory was subtle but profound. She had shown that courage and honesty could shift power in ways money never could. Her presence reminded everyone that dignity is not a privilege reserved for the wealthy, it is a right of every human being. Guests began to approach her cautiously, some offering words of respect, others simply curious to understand the strength that had silenced a billionaire. Their admiration was quiet, sincere. The room felt lighter, yet heavier, carrying the weight of a lesson that had been learned in real time, that empathy, integrity, and courage are more valuable than status or wealth. The billionaire took a deep breath and stepped forward. His earlier pride had been replaced by genuine humility. "I want to thank you," he said, his voice steady but soft, "for reminding me of what truly matters. I have been blind to more than I realized, and tonight, you've shown me a truth I will not forget." The girl simply nodded, her eyes meeting his briefly. She did not need more. The acknowledgement itself was powerful. He looked around the room, at the staff, the scholarship students, and the other guests. He realized that his influence could now be used differently, not as a tool for admiration or status, but as a force for genuine change. The gala, meant to celebrate wealth, had instead highlighted the strength of those often overlooked. For the first time, he saw that true leadership requires listening, humility, and an understanding of lives beyond one's own. As the evening progressed, the crowd began to disperse, but the energy had shifted irreversibly. The girl left the ballroom with quiet confidence. She had come as a guest of charity, yet she had left as a catalyst for awareness, an example of strength and grace that even the most powerful could not ignore. Her story would ripple in the minds of everyone present, a reminder that courage and integrity can challenge the most entrenched power structures. The billionaire remained for a few moments longer, reflecting. He understood that this single encounter had changed him profoundly. It was not the first time wealth had brought him recognition, but it was the first time an event like this had demanded moral reckoning. He had been humbled, and the lesson would stay with him, guiding future decisions, interactions, and choices. Outside the ballroom, the city lights continued to shine, indifferent to the events that had just transpired. Yet within that small, opulent room, a transformation had occurred. What began as an embarrassing accident had evolved into a powerful statement about human dignity, accountability, and the unexpected power of a single voice. The girl had reminded everyone present that strength is not measured by wealth, and respect cannot be bought. She had revealed the truth that the billionaire, and the world around him, needed to see. And in doing so, she left a lasting impression, not just on him, but on every person in the room who had witnessed her courage. By the end of the night, it was clear, the true story was not about the spill, the luxury, or the social hierarchy. It was about humanity. About recognizing the worth of every individual. About the transformative power of words spoken with honesty and confidence. And most importantly, it was about how one young girl, standing tall in the face of privilege and power, had reminded the world that dignity and courage always demand attention. The gala had ended, the lights dimmed, and the guests had gone their separate ways. Yet the lesson lingered, a quiet, unshakable reminder that sometimes, one person's voice is enough to change the course of an entire room, an entire mindset, and perhaps, even a lifetime.